This is a production of Cornell University.
So just wanted to start looking at a few websites here. Wanted to encourage all of you to take a look at the Cornell's climate change website, climatechange.cornell.edu. It's got resources for students indicating courses, the climate change minor. It's got resources not only for agriculture, but also for communities, youth programs, et cetera. And you can subscribe to it and get news and events like this seminar and many others that are happening on campus. I've also got there the Cornell Institute for Climate Change and Ag's website focused on farming, and then my website for those of you who might be interested in finding out more about what I do. Okay, so with this talk today, before we get into the future, we're going to begin by giving you kind of the full historical sweep of agriculture and climate change, and talk about climate change before humans were really affecting the planet, and how that related to early crop domestication, and et cetera. So I think you saw some version of this slide when Art de Gaetano was here, those of you who've been following the whole thing. Down at the bottom of this, we have the temperature trace for the last 400,000 years. And you can see as we came out of the last ice age about 10,000 years ago, over the course of a couple thousand years, temperature rose about 6 to 8 degrees centigrade, and we entered this relatively stable period of climate called the Holocene. And it's right about then, 10,000 years ago, when crop domestication, the Neolithic revolution, happened around the world at slightly different times, and for other factors were involved, but certainly the stable and warming climate is what set the stage. Notice also that this is before we began our love affair with fossil fuels, before the Industrial Revolution. You'll see if you look at the CO2 trace across the top that we're going back and forth simply between 200 and 280 parts per million during all of this time. So it's before the Industrial Revolution. But it's that stability of climate that really was one of the first influences of climate, non-human induced climate on agriculture. Before that, Homo sapiens were around for about 100,000 years before that, a few million people on the planet. But once we hit that Neolithic revolution, population really skyrocketed. This is another graph still looking at the past, but not quite so far back, just looking back 2,000 years. And we're looking here at a couple little bumps, ups and downs. I talked about the Holocene being a very stable climate, but there are a few little ups and downs. There's the so-called medieval warm period, where if you look at this, you can see it's about a half-degree temperature increase occurred about 1,000 years ago. It led to a very interesting story about Viking agriculture expanding into Greenland, northern Norway. And so this is just illustrating how in the past, people, farmers, responded to climate change. This happened over a few hundred years. And keep in mind the magnitude of this, less than a half degree centigrade warming, and we see that kind of response. And then this was followed by a cooling event. This whole cooling event, as we went from this medieval above normal temperatures, to the so-called Little Ice Age, which was not a real ice age by any means, but it was about half to 8/10 of a degree of cooling. So collectively, it was about 1 degree to 2 degrees centigrade of cooling over several hundred years. And what we saw is much of this expansion of agriculture disappeared, settlements disappeared, and as we got into the 1500s, 1600s in Europe, food security problems happening throughout Europe. When we come to the French Revolution, kind of at the tail end of the Little Ice Age, there had been decades of food shortages, which actually plays one contributing factor actually to the French Revolution. So one of the lessons from the past is it doesn't take much temperature change to affect food production and have pretty major socioeconomic impacts. This is just a little bit of data from the Little Ice Age. Probably hard to see from the back of the room, but this is a map of Northern Europe, and the black circles are areas of Norway where settlements were abandoned during the Little Ice Age due to climate change. And then this is showing the average male height in Europe, and the low point here actually just showing nutritional problems with people during the Little Ice Age. That's how much the food security problems were affected by, again, less than a degree C of cooling, significant effects on that. Today we often get into debates about who's causing climate change. There were witch hunts during the Little Ice Age, blaming witches. One of the Pope Innocent VIII, I think it was, started some of this notion. Okay, now jumping ahead to another event. Now this is a little bit after the Industrial Revolution, but actually this is the 1920s, 30s Dust Bowl, 1930s Dust Bowl problem with the Southern Great Plains that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. At this time, the CO2 levels in the atmosphere, our fossil fuel burning was not really affecting climate in a big way. But what happened was, of course, in our manifest destiny, a big westward expansion, farmers were heading out west, and they were digging up these deep tall grass prairies that had been there for centuries. Little known to them really at the time for most of those farmers was the fact that drought had come and gone in this area for many centuries, and these prairie grasses and the excellent soils that they led to really helped hold the soil in place during periodic, every so many decades, severe droughts. It happened that in the 1920s was a period of unusually wet conditions. So at the beginning of this whole phenomenon, farmers were kind of spoiled thinking rainfall was great out here, and they tore up a lot of those prairies to put in wheat. They left the land fallow, that is without any vegetation during the winter, and then lo and behold, in the middle of the 30s had a really bad combo, a three-way hit, high winds, extremely high temperatures, and extreme drought. And you can see that tractor buried in the soil from one of the windstorms. These are just some of the impacts of this is just showing the sensitivity of food production to, really just a bad combination of extreme weather events for a couple of years in an area. Lost a lot of our topsoil. We see already evidence of the kind of inequities of impacts. Usually the poor are most affected by these kind of weather-related, climate-related impacts. Environmental refugees, the biggest migration in US history, actually. The one positive thing about the Dust Bowl is it led to the Soil Erosion Act, which eventually led to our Soil Conservation Service, which eventually led to our USDA NRCS service today, which works a lot on protecting our soils and building healthy soils, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, that's so much for the past. So where do we go from here? This is another kind of that same, looking back 400,000 years from the graphic I showed you earlier. This is just showing that CO2 trace going up and down during all that time. As you recall, the real ice ages, as Art De Gaetano told you in one of the early lectures, are caused by planetary, the Earth's orbit changing, really astronomical features. But during all that time, the CO2 was kind of tracking temperature a little bit up and down between 280. Crop domestication in the lower right-hand corner, again, about 10,000 years ago. And here's where we are today in terms of CO2. So you can see we've already reached, close to over 400 parts per million now, well beyond what we've seen in the atmosphere for over 400,000 years. And with that, we've already seen a warming that, notice, is greater than what we saw in the medieval warm period. But in a much faster period of time. The medieval warm period happened during a couple hundred years. This has happened, really, much of this in my lifetime, actually. Of course, what we worry about is what's projected for the end of this century. So this is, next slide is, next addition to this is going to show projections for end of century. So this is the so-called business as usual scenario. Notice that this is a magnitude of change almost equal to the last ice age transition, which took place over 1,000 years, but happening in 100 years. Of course, we hope we get on a better path, as was talked about at the last Climate Paris meetings, something more like this that we might be able to adapt to. This, again, is end of century. The Climate Paris meetings talked about by 2035, trying to keep our increase in temperature below about 2 or 2.5 degrees centigrade. So we certainly hope we go there, but that's what farmers are up against, and we all are in the future. So given that background, what do we have to deal with in terms of food security by mid-century? So, our population has risen tremendously from those early days of crop domestication. That Neolithic revolution increased human populations quite dramatically, and then the Industrial Revolution led us from a few million of Homo sapiens wandering the planet to, as we all know, about 7 billion today, and probably 9.5 billion by the middle of this century. We're going to have to produce 60% more food than is produced now for that expanded population, and changing diets, particularly things like increased meat production, which I'll talk about a little later in this seminar, putting increased demand on resources and impacts on the environment. 75% of that's going to have to come from producing more food from the same amount of land, and many regions have degraded soils and limited water resources already, even without climate change. And of course, climate change just exacerbates this challenge. So we've accomplished a lot as a species in terms of crop domestication and in terms of the green revolution that took place in the early 20th, mid-20th century, but we have some serious challenges ahead. What we're already seeing, even forgetting about projections of the future, but already we are seeing around the Northern Hemisphere in particular, risk of heat stress, drought, and heavy rains all increasing. Some of the previous climate scientist speakers have talked about all of these issues with you. For crops and agriculture, it obviously has negative implications for yield potential. Flooded conditions, it's not only direct effects on crops, but also access to get into the field for farmers. So a real problem, farmers getting into plant, getting into harvest. So flooding, in addition to direct crop damage, can be a problem. For livestock, particularly like dairy cows, I'm not an animal scientist, I'm much more of a plant scientist, but I've learned from my animal scientist friends that dairy cows like it cool. 45 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit is ideal for them in terms of milk production. The graphic on the lower right is from a study we did several years ago with a milk production model that the animal scientists have, showing that in the Northeast we'll have milk production declines due to dairy heat stress, unless farmers do something to alleviate this, do something to adapt. And so an obvious thing for farmers to adapt to this would be improving the cooling capacity of their dairy barns. But this costs money and is a cost for farmers to have to deal with. Another thing is not the direct effects of climate change, but how it's affecting the dynamics of weed, pest, and disease pressure. And this is a particular problem for higher latitude areas like where we are here in upstate New York, where we've often benefited in the past from relatively low weed, disease, insect pressure because our severe winters kill a lot of things off. Several years ago, kudzu, some of you from the South may be aware of it, a very invasive, aggressive weed species. We projected it would be coming into New York as winters continue to get warmer. And indeed, Lou Ziska, my colleague at USDA Beltsville, who follows this, has now found kudzu showing up in upstate New York. In the upper left there's a flea beetle, tiny little insect. Doesn't do a lot of direct plant damage usually, but carries a terrible disease for corn called Stewart's wilt. It marginally, historically, overwinters here, but it's doing much better with warmer winters. And I think last week, Christy Goodale talked about the mountain pine beetle and its relationship to climate change and effects on lodgepole pine. So besides these direct climate effects, farmers have to deal with those things. One thing we have to say, though, is that for high latitude regions like where we are, there's obviously a potential silver lining as well. We already are seeing, this is observed data from the most recent National Climate Assessment, increases in the frost-free period across the United States. For a place like New York, that opens up new possible crops farmers might grow, new market opportunities. And indeed, I've talked to farmers about this, and some of our corn growers have been experimenting with longer growing season corn varieties because those yield more, they're out in the field longer. We've talked about the European wine grapes from our Finger Lakes wine industry, maybe doing better. Some of the red Merlots and Cabernets doing better with longer growing seasons. So there's certainly that as opportunities. And here at Cornell and the Institute for Climate Change and Ag, we're all about exploring those opportunities, working with farmers to take advantage of those things. But keep in mind, like I said, the insects, et cetera, and weeds gain advantages in this way as well. One kind of thing we didn't really brace ourselves for is forgetting how complex climate change is. And what we've actually been hearing from farmers in this part of the country is we have, I think as Art De Gaetano showed you in one of the earlier lectures, we have an increased frequency of heavy rainfall events in the Northeast. And a lot of farmers are saying, yeah, we got a longer frost-free period. Dave, you told us we could try longer growing season varieties, but I've got all this seed and I can't get into plant. There's been some years where we've had one of the longest growing seasons in terms of the frost-free period ever. But it's the shortest as far as the farmers are concerned because they couldn't get into plant. There's also issues with them not getting into harvest or mid-season fertilizer applications. So it's not just about the frost-free period. So we still have challenges in this area. And this is very difficult to predict. And what farmers are feeling is it's just the unpredictability is a big challenge. So they're doing things like diversifying, staggering planting dates. And what we're seeing in both New York and the Midwest is farmers investing in new equipment that can cover more acreage faster in order to get into what they see as smaller windows of opportunity to get in the field. So in the Midwest, for example, the corn farmers are getting even bigger planters to do more rows. Here in New York, harvesting hay in the fall, they're getting bigger hay harvesters so they can get out there in between these rain events. So that's a form of adaptation, but again, not cheap for the farmer. And this unexpected thing about farming, I mean, I never expected when I got into this 20-something years ago that one of the grower groups that would be calling me out most often to talk about climate change would be the fruit growers, but to talk about this phenomenon of more frost and freeze damage that they feel like they're experiencing in a warmer world. And indeed, what we're seeing is with the more variable winters, in 2012, we lost nearly half the apple crop in New York State. We're usually second or third in the US, millions of dollars lost because of a total record-breaking 4-week earlier than normal bloom date. This year, just was talking to Greg Peck, who I think is out there somewhere in the audience, our fruit crop specialist faculty member in the horticulture department. We're seeing some of this kind of damage again, not as severe as 2012, but a real problem. And with the grapes, I talked about an advantage for grapes with a longer growing season, but we've seen some midwinter freezing damage because of that. And the climate scientists still have trouble telling us, is the winter really getting more variable, or is it just getting warmer? And in my own group, we have a apple bloom model, and we're trying to look at climate projections. And is this going to be a big new problem, or just the same? And we don't know. There's some things we don't know. Given all this, I just want to say a few things about farmer attitudes about climate change. And this kind of gets into the notion of communicating to farmers about climate change, which is something I've been wrestling with for over 20 years. And our cooperative extension staff are often concerned, a little bit reticent to talk about climate change with farmers because it's been such a politicized issue, as you know. But here's a few things I think we can say about farmers and attitudes about climate change. I've never met, and I've worked with farmers all over the world at this point, I've never met a farmer anywhere who isn't concerned about extreme weather events and uncertainty about the weather. And what we're finding is that today, most farmers around the world, including the US, feel that the weather's getting even more uncertain. It's not that it's just getting a little warmer, but they're just seeing record-breaking events of all kinds that they've never seen before. Now, farmers do have a problem of detecting, is this a real climate change trend I need to spend money out of my pocket to adapt to, or is it just normal, quote, normal weird weather? And this is the same thing our climate scientists have to deal with. And this is where the climate scientists can really provide a lot of help and where a university can play a major role in helping farmers detect this. So we can tell a farmer, yes, you've been seeing more flooding events and you're not alone. This is happening across the entire northern hemisphere. We think this is a long-term trend. This is something you might adapt to. We have farmers asking us, like I said, about the frost risk. That's something we don't know much about. Hail risk, again, we less certainty about that, but we can try to help. Then on the mitigation end, farmers being part of the solution, which the last part of my talk will get into, not just adapting to climate change, but being part of the solution, reducing their carbon footprint. All farmers are concerned about energy costs. Farmers went to diesel engines many years ago before there was talk about climate change because it was more energy efficient. So they're all about that, saving money on their farm. And I think this is the entry point for talking to farmers about mitigation. However, I will say farmers are also very concerned and in some cases I would say paranoid about climate change policies that might affect their pocketbook. So many farmers tell me, yes, I'm concerned about climate change, but I'm more concerned about some crazy climate change policy that's going to affect, let's say, the cost of my fossil fuel to transport my produce around the world. There are some farmers who have gasoline bills of $200,000 a year to transport their produce around the world. And if that goes up to $300,000, they've just lost $100,000 because of a carbon tax. So you can see why they're concerned. And that's I don't, all I can tell you is these are a few items I'd say where farmers are coming from on this issue. I'm not going to go through all these things in detail. I'm going to talk about a few of them in a little more detail, but this is sort of our laundry list of things farmers can do to adapt to climate change. And in fact, in most cases, farmers have been ahead of us, not behind us, on doing this intuitively, even if they don't call it climate change. Weird weather, adapting to what they see as events that are affecting their bottom line. So there's things they can do in animal management facilities. I said improve the cooling capacity. Diversifying is a very classic way to adapt to climate change. Hedge your bets. Different varieties of crops, a mix, different planting dates, et cetera. Looking at new crops, more reliance on integrated pest management for these new pest problems. I'll talk more about soil resilience, building healthy soils to give you some resilience to climate change. Purchasing a new irrigation system or putting in a drainage system if need be. Food crop frost protection, and as I mentioned, larger scale farm equipment. So these are all things farmers can do. It's not rocket science. The problem is none of these are cost or risk free. So it costs the farmer money, and they need to know whether it's really worth it. So they need to know, is this normal bad weather? Do I invest in a drainage system? No, maybe I should invest in an irrigation system, or both, and when? Again, this is where I think universities can play a role, and like the Cornell's Institute for Climate Change is all about developing tools for farmers to help make these decisions. And there's no always straightforward answer. It's a risk assessment that the farmer, the business person, eventually has to make. One thing we certainly worry about are financial barriers. Many of our dairy farmers in upstate New York are pretty close to the edge financially. Some of them have trouble getting credit. So even if a relatively small investment of, say, $10,000, $20,000 could fix up their dairy barn with a little better cooling capacity and get them through the next couple of decades, they may not be able to get that loan. So how do we deal with that? We need policies to wrestle with that. And of course, at the global level, we have this, even bigger scale, the developed versus the developing nation, and big differences in adaptation capacity. So again, this is a role for beyond the farm adaptation to climate change. And I think my next slide talks about beyond the farm adaptations, things that we can do to support farmers around the world for adapting to climate change. And the big one is financial assistance for adaptation. There's a new thing at the United Nations is talking about the Green Climate Fund, which would be all about providing some financial assistance for adaptation around the world, providing new decision tools, as I've talked about, better weather seasonal forecasting, plant breeding and animal breeding for dealing with climate change. And I'll talk a little bit more about that one in a moment, pest monitoring, and then policies and community planning, et cetera. So there's a role for farmers, and there's also a role for people like us at universities and governments, et cetera, and communities. This is just one example. I spent my sabbatical leave last year at the University of Florida. One reason I went there is they have this agroclimate program in the Southeast. Really excellent tools they're developing for farmers to deal with real-time weather challenges, but also climate change, seasonal climate events like El Nino, et cetera, all down into phone apps. And they're doing some really cool stuff, and we're doing some of the same kind of things here at Cornell, and we think going beyond even what they've got going on. But there's a lot of this sort of activity happening across the globe. This is a couple of years ago, I was out in San Francisco and visited this new startup company that kind of was started by actually some Google geek types who started their own company called the Climate Corporation. And they got in the business of, they realized that actually, farmers there was so much more data out there that farmers could access beyond just watching the evening weather forecast that has historically been available. But there's 30 years of satellite data. There's remote sensing data that farmers could capture for their own farm. And all of this could feed into decisions. So we went to visit them and see what they were up to. They had some fantastic, cool looking apps. They didn't have a lot of agronomists working with them. I wasn't sure where it was going to go, but it was a really neat idea. Wasn't sure where it was going to go. Came back home, and about 2 or 3 months later, Monsanto bought them out for $1 billion. So, industry sees the opportunity for giving farmers new tools like that. I mentioned developing countries, and I do some work in East Africa, as was mentioned, and different parts of the world are more or less sensitive to these El Nino, La Nina cycles, which are not really necessarily part of climate change, but they're very important for giving farmers kind of a, beyond just a few days of a weather forecast, looking at a longer term projection of what the whole season might look like. So be able to tell a farmer, during the growing season, this is likely that you have a such and such probability that it's going to be a wetter than normal year or a drier than normal growing season, et cetera. By looking at the history, we now have good records of 40 so years of El Nino, La Nina events. We have 30 years of satellite data that even for remote areas like Africa, we can look at rainfall that's been happening. And this is just showing for East Africa. It's very different. The blue indicates areas that in an El Nino year tend to be a little wetter than normal. Down in south parts of South Africa, drier than normal in an El Nino year. So we have a new proposal in. I'm working with Toby Alt, who gave one of your prior talks here, climate scientist, and Rachel Besner-Kerr, development sociologist, on, first of all, bringing farmers there up to speed on what El Nino, La Nina is, working with their meteorology agencies, the country meteorology agencies on providing farmers with information on El Nino, La Nina years, and fine-tuning how we can provide better forecasts of this for farmers. So another way of kind of producing tools for farmers. I want to say something about plant breeding and biotechnology. Now in the class I teach, Plant Horde 3600, the same title as my talk today, we have discussion sections once a week, and it gets into lots, what we really focus on is a lot of debatable, controversial issues, and this is one of our usually favorite, most heated discussions about what's the role of biotechnology in plant breeding and climate change. We have a lot of opinions among the students, and I'm sure here in the room we do. This is my opinion. I think that plant breeding and biotechnology are certainly an important strategy for increasing the number of varieties resistant to various types of stresses that we are going to encounter. And I think I view adaptation to climate change as we need to have kind of all of the above in our arsenal of what we're going to do to tackle it. But there are some issues and some shortcomings. I think I've seen this oversold, people acting like, don't worry about climate change. We're going to quick with our new biotechnology things. We're going to give you drought-tolerant varieties and this and that, no problem. So I've got some challenges and concerns. First of all, given the unpredictable nature of climate change, in some years, farmers in one area can have both heat stress and cold stress, or about too much rain and too little rain in the same growing season. So what's the optimum crop traits for that? What are the optimum genes to be? It's not simply that it's getting a little warmer, a little hotter. And so a lot of areas, it's very complicated to know what you would even breed for, what you want. Often we find that stress-tolerant varieties, yes, they can survive, like our desert plants can survive heat stress, but they're plants this big. Nobody wants a corn plant that's that big but survives heat stress. So they often have low yield potential, these stress-tolerant types. So easy to come up with a gene that makes a plant able to withstand drought, but it might not grow very fast, and there's lots of reasons for that. A lot of our success to date with new technologies, new biotechnology examples, are really kind of focused on single gene or very few gene phenomenon, whereas a lot of stress tolerance involves many suites of genes. Unique suites of genes, for example, for drought stress, are required for whether the drought's going to occur during the early growth stage or during pollination or during harvest. So to give a plant protection for the whole growing season, you'd have to have probably hundreds or thousands of new genes inserted into the genome to make it successful. And then finally, there's the issue of farmer access to these new products of biotechnology. How expensive would the seed be? How would that affect food prices? And then, of course, the issue with some of you might be thinking about GMOs, consumers. Some consumers won't eat GMOs. There's issues with acceptance of these. And so we could come up with some magical crops, and we still have to think about consumer concerns about these things. And then finally, of course, with all things equitable access, as I mentioned, both this kind of resource and also information for farmers. Okay, in my time that's left, I've kind of been talking so far, emphasizing coping with inevitable climate change. I think at this point, the horse is out of the barn to some extent. We're going to have some kind of we already are having some level of climate change, exceeding what we saw during the medieval warm period. And farmers are having to cope. It's changing our climate in unusual ways. But now what about farmers and what they can do to slow the pace of climate change? In that class I mentioned, we have a game we've developed called Cropopoly with this, which the students usually enjoy quite a bit. And it's all about developing farming systems that do both things, both help farms become more adapted to climate change, but also reduce their carbon footprint. And it's not easy, as the students who've taken the class would tell you. This shows a lot of the ins and outs and the different greenhouse gases associated with farming. I'm not going to go into all these in detail, but in the next several slides, I'm going to talk about a few of these. The first is we think about farm energy use efficiency. Let's get rid of that. One thing I want to say is even before we talk about what's happening on the farm in terms of energy use efficiency, just a farmer going to buy, for example, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, there's a lot of energy embedded in those products. It's about 4 to 6 tons of carbon are emitted per ton of nitrogen manufactured in the Haber-Bosch process, which is used to produce synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. So that's part of the carbon footprint. And notice how big this is from just for the US. Notice how the fertilizer energy embedded in that is as significant as the energy, the CO2 emissions associated with the use of diesel for tractor driving on the farm. So that's a significant piece of farm. So anything we can do to reduce inputs, these high energy cost inputs for farms, is reducing the carbon footprint. And it saves farmers money as well. Farmers are really all about renewable energy. Again, I would say I've never met a farmer anywhere who's not interested in something that's going to reduce their cost of production by providing some free energy or a good investment, whether it's a wind turbine on the farm or solar panels or whatever, just like a homeowner looking at the cost effectiveness of this. And farmers are all about this, have no negative feelings about this, and many of them are experimenting with this. We see out in the Midwest the corn soybean belt, not a bunch of Al Gore fans out there, but you see a lot of wind turbines and a lot of solar out there. Biofuel crops. This is another area where in my class we have it's controversial and we have good debates. So I'll say this about biofuel crops. From this standpoint, they're much superior to fossil fuels. If you think about fossil fuels, we're taking carbon that's been buried deep in the earth and no part of our climate system, bringing it up to the surface, burning it for our energy, and now it's up there as CO2 and part of the climate problem for many hundreds of years possibly to come. If we allow instead, we grow plants to suck up CO2 from the atmosphere, then we burn them for energy. Yes, the CO2 goes up in the atmosphere just like fossil fuels, but it's CO2 that was already up there. We're not adding new CO2 to the atmosphere. From that standpoint, biofuels are a cool idea as far as I'm concerned. However, it does depend on when you grow, where you grow it, how you grow it. If you're using more, for example, if you're using a lot of nitrogen fertilizer, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer with energy embedded in it to grow the crop, that's not going to do you much good. If you're growing food crops like corn that raises food prices, that's a problem. If you're growing biofuel crops on our prime cropland that impedes on food production, that's not such a good thing either. So it's kind of, in my mind, there's a place for this, and it's when, how, what we grow, and how we do it that really matters. I like showing this slide when I go to policy briefings in DC to see if people can recognize this photo. I don't know what you see when you see this, but I see carbon, nitrogen, and energy. And this is kind of the big challenge, I think, of today's ag scientists. In the past century, places like Cornell did a lot of work really decoupling animal crop production systems for efficiency of scale and all of that. The challenge today is recoupling waste management, recoupling animal and crop production systems to take advantage of our manures, for example, for what they contain. There's systems called anaerobic digesters, which can actually use waste like this, capture the methane and use that as an energy source, for example. And of course, manures added to soils help build organic matter, which is good for soil health. On the agriculture greenhouse gas emissions, I wanted to say something about animal production in particular. So ruminant animals, CH4 refers to methane, so we're talking about methane emission, and N2O on this refers to nitrous oxide. You can see a big issue with animal agriculture. This is just for the US. Ruminant animals like beef and dairy, sheep would be in this category as well. As you all know, they do the burping and whatever releasing methane as part of their digestive process. They have bacteria in their gut that release methane. Also manure, when it's wet, any kind of anaerobic, low oxygen environment, you can get these methanogen bacteria going. And so any manure pile that stays wet releases methane. So livestock production, very important feature of methane production worldwide. This isn't like comparing the different species necessarily. For example, this is based on how many numbers of these different animals there are in the US, but definitely beef and dairy cows are the main methane producers in the US. Methane also can occur with rice paddy production because in wet flooded soils you have methane production. This is just showing when it comes to agriculture, again, it's not the CO2 emissions from tractor driving on the farm, which might be your intuition. The big culprits for most of the developed world, at least, is methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions. In both these graphs, the methane on the left and nitrous oxide on the right, the green shaded areas refer to agriculture emissions. So looking at the methane on the left, rice production accounting for 11% of worldwide related to human activity, methane production, and then ruminant animals, these particularly beef, cows, and sheep, goats, a very large fraction. You can see the gray area there, 29% associated with things like fossil fuel industry releases some methane, and fracking is in that category. Nitrous oxide agriculture is even more to blame, I guess you might say. Approximately 1% of the nitrogen fertilizer put on land escapes in the microbial breakdown of the nitrogen fertilizers as nitrous oxide. The greenhouse gas is about 300 times more potent than CO2 on a molecule per molecule basis. So anything we can do to improve the efficiency of nitrogen fertilizer applications, reduce that, is a good thing. So in terms of nitrogen management, first of all, just buying the synthetic nitrogen fertilizers is an issue, energy intensity to produce. And then all nitrogen fertilizers, even if you're using manures or whatever, when they break down in the soil, about 1% of the nitrogen in there can escape as nitrous oxide, so you don't want to overdo it. This is showing also a picture of a farmer growing legume crops in rotation with cash crops. These legume crops provide nitrogen for free, you might say, because of their symbiotic relationship with bacteria on their roots. So it's avoiding having to buy synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. So at least that part of the carbon footprint with nitrogen is good. Here at Cornell, we've developed, Harold Van Ness in particular, my group, and I've got a project that has helped fund a little bit of this. This Adapt-In tool, which has now been commercialized. It takes real-time weather data and gives farmers information on how much the microbial activity is providing some free nitrogen for them and can help them reduce the amount of nitrogen the additional nitrogen they might apply mid-season to crops. And it's now being commercialized, available in 26 states, helps farmers reduce nitrogen inputs, save them money, and essentially we found very few examples of reductions in yield, but reductions in nitrogen fertilizer and nitrous oxide emissions. Peter, in introducing me, mentioned, I'm very involved in soil health, and my two worlds kind of really interact a lot these days. Soil health management really is much about building up organic matter in soils. Worldwide, as land goes out of natural ecosystems like forests and grasslands, gets broken up and moves into agriculture, we can typically, if it's not managed properly, lose 30 to 50% of the organic matter, and that's 30 to 50% of the carbon stored in those soils, can go up into the air as CO2, greenhouse gas. So we can do things to try to build up that organic matter, reducing tillage, winter cover crops that keep bringing in carbon from the atmosphere via photosynthesis all year long, and using these organic matter inputs as well to help build up organic matter. And also soils that are high in organic matter are more resistant to climate change. They have better water holding capacity for short-term droughts and some flooding stress. So kind of a real win-win strategy. In terms of the mitigation in developing countries where they're not using lots of nitrogen fertilizers, the bigger issue there has been slash and burn agriculture and deforestation. So not keeping the soils well maintained, so they're having to keep expanding for an expanding population and cutting down new forest land to expand production. And that accounts for 11% of total human greenhouse gas emissions associated with global warming is deforestation worldwide. And a lot of that is associated with agriculture. So a big challenge in the developing world is really helping farmers maintain their soil in good quality so they can slow down that pace of having to expand into forest land, and looking at agroforestry projects. This is just a project in Zambia I was involved with many other people. 20 or so thousand farmers in a co-op, poorest of the poor landholders. They were having a lot of problems with just food security because of poor soil quality and degradation, loss of organic matter. A long-term project involved in helping them rebuild those soils, including planting some of these trees here. This tree here is a mature nitrogen-fixing tree that they've now interplanted in their farms. And this nitrogen-fixing tree, when its leaves fall from the ground, not only add organic matter, but they're very nitrogen-rich. And this was written up in a PNAS paper for those of you who are interested in that. So what's the actual mitigation potential of agriculture and forestry? This is sort of there's been a lot of talk and a lot of interest in this for many years. A recent paper, actually part of a project that was mentioned, that Peter mentioned, I'm involved with on new tools for carbon, nitrogen, greenhouse gas emissions. We have a paper out in Nature that reviewed some of the literature on this. This is I would say, top mark of what we might accomplish. There's a lot of constraints to this. We have areas of the world where farmers don't have the organic inputs to actually rebuild their soils. They don't have access to manures, or they use the crop residue for fuel to heat their homes, and hard to rebuild their soils. There's other issues that can be involved. Constraints. Sandy soils don't hold as much carbon as others. But anyway, some real potential. At the recent climate talks, the French Minister of Agriculture put forth a proposal talking about increasing the soils of all the agricultural land worldwide by 0.4% per year in terms of their carbon. This could actually supplant all of the annual atmospheric CO2 emissions. So very kind of pie in the sky, I would say, but a very ambitious proposal. Louise Buck was here talking a bit about integrated land management, and the organization that she was talking about there is very involved in this thing of rebuilding soils. There's an interesting group in the Soil Health Partnership, some of the biggest corn growers, the National Corn Growers Association, working with the Nature Conservancy and Walmart, all working together on rebuilding soils. And Cornell's Soil Health Program, I've got their website there too, involved in that. So there's real potential there. It's not insignificant. Whether we can reach this high mark is a challenge, but it's there. So finally, I want to say a little bit about the broader food system in my last few minutes, bring it all the way around to all of you out there who are consumers at least. So I've been talking mostly about the planting, growing, and harvesting of food, but there's this whole ring of things in the food system. Distribution is an interesting one. I went to the Long Island Farmers Association meeting right after the Superstorm Sandy. And the farmers there were not talking about damage, like direct damage to crops so much, as the roadways being totally wiped out for 2 to 3 weeks. So they had much of their produce just rotted in their storage facilities because they couldn't get it out. So it's not just about growing and harvesting, but things like that are important. And then, of course, what we eat makes a difference too. This is another good controversy we like to get into in my class. Human diet and vegetarian versus meat consumption. There was a talk in the biogeochemistry seminar series this last week talking about a significant part of the Amazon that's been converted to soybean production is soybeans that are being grown there, land that has historically been deforested, to ship to China for pork production. As China's been really going through the roof in terms of per capita meat consumption, not even still catching up to us, of course, this puts a lot of pressure on our resources. And this is just showing one study's analysis. I don't have time to go into a lot of data, but it just shows, this is looking at the future, thinking of future food needs by 2050. What it would take at kind of current projected meat consumption worldwide. It would take about, on annual greenhouse gas emissions, would be in this neighborhood, 3.3 gigatons carbon equivalents. If we were to just all go to a healthy, quote, healthy low meat diet, not vegetarian, we could reduce that by a third. If we had no ruminant meat, none of these methane emission animals, we cut that in half. I don't know how many vegans we have here. I don't know if I could ever go there. I like my dairy products, but dramatic reduction. So it makes a difference what consumers do. To be transparent about it, I'm kind of a vegetarian wannabe. I've tried a couple times, but I haven't found having a low meat diet, it feels healthier to me, and that has a significant impact. So I think every little bit we might do as consumers can play a role. This is my last slide. So in addition to thinking about meat consumption, there's other things you can do when you go to the grocery store. We've been working with Walmart because they're very interested in reducing the carbon footprint of the food they have on their shelves because the consumers care. I don't think Walmart really gives a hoot, but they're getting this information from consumers. And so we can use market forces to affect farmer choices and affect the sustainability of agriculture. So asking your grocer, where are you getting your food that I'm buying? Are they using climate smart practices? Eating local foods in season, not out of season, like tomatoes in New York in the winter would not be a good idea because you're probably using a lot of fossil fuels to heat the greenhouses to grow the tomatoes. Minimizing package and waste. And then, as I say, a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, grains, and modest meat consumption is one angle you might take. So with that, I'll stop, and I think I've got some time for questions. Thanks.
One of your very first slides, your very first one, you had the little ice age, and then you had the warming phase, MWP.
Yeah, medieval warming period, yeah. So that was about 1,000 years ago. And then there was it was followed by the little ice age. And the best we understand, the climate scientists understand, is the little ice age was related to a kind of unusual solar dimming event that affected things worldwide. There's some discussion that the Mayan drought that occurred during that time may have been affiliated with that. But there also were a lot of volcanic eruptions, quite a flurry of volcanic eruptions during the little ice age. Some of the causes of that are understood and some not. But it was a little blip, as I said, compared to what we're experiencing, what's in store for us in the future. Yeah. Yeah, and the little ice age, it's a misnomer. I mean, the real ice age is, dip down 6 to 10 degrees cooler than what we've got today.
I've heard conflicting things actually about buying local foods because there's some people who argue that by buying local you're having to go to more different stores and you as a consumer are using more fossil fuels trying to pick up all those products versus shipping one truck of 1,000 oranges, for example. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it is. I know the Union of Concerned Scientists did an interesting study on that showed, it does. You really have to think about that a little bit. There's not that much, if you do, a large shipment, it depends on exactly what the transportation mechanism is and all of that, how much it matters in terms of getting local. But I would say, in general, it makes a lot of sense, but not if you are having to drive all over. You'd have to question that. Certainly, something like oranges we can't grow here anyway. So what can you do about that? But things that we do grow here we start producing corn and tomatoes and a lot of vegetables during the summer. We do a lot of cool season crops like broccoli and cabbage and that sort of thing. So growing those when they're in season makes a lot of sense. Buying them directly from the farmer, one trip to the farmer's market. Definitely plays a significant role. I think can reduce your own carbon footprint. But you do have to think about it a little bit. It's not just quite so simple as always buy local food because, especially as I say, doing it out of season there can be a lot of fossil fuel use in producing food out of season in an area like here.
Do you think there's enough evidence to advocate veganism as the best way to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of our food system, or do you think there is any role for animal agriculture to increase the resilience or sustainability of the agroecology of the ecosystem?
Could you repeat that again? So do I think there's a role for them? Or?
Yeah, so is the best way to reduce the the warming impact of agriculture to advocate a vegan diet for everyone, or is there a role for animal? Do you think there's a role for animal?
Oh yeah, no. I mean, it's this is something, you know. There's opinions out there, and so I've got my own I would say somewhat educated opinion, but when we do this in my class, we have opinions all over the place, and a lot of them are quite valid. So I think there's certainly some parts of the world, quite a few places in the world, where there's large groups of people where the soils are not conducive to growing any kind of crops for food production. So they have animals grazing, nomadic herdsmen, et cetera. Many parts of the world, they're eating goats or whatever. They have no choice, and you know that makes plenty of sense there. I think the rotational grazing and the way you manage an animal production system, as opposed to probably the worst case is having large confined animal facilities where you're bringing in shipping in lots of, you have to have the transportation, the fossil fuel emissions of transporting lots of food to the animals across the world or whatever, and then feeding them that and all of that, as opposed to rotational grazing on grasslands, which are storing a lot of carbon in the soils. So I think there's livestock production systems which really minimize agricultural livestock production. And people argue, well, there's wild ruminants out there. There were lots of buffalo on the plains before we had before we did livestock production, et cetera. So there's arguments either way. But I think there's a lot to be said for improving our animal agriculture to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's one too.
Do you think that there's any real help in the advancement of like perennial grain crops?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think I don't know if you noticed one of my slides. I did have that mentioned as one aspect to building healthy soils. So having more perennial, whether it's agroforestry and simply interplanting with certain types of trees or plants that have historically been perennial, or actually breeding like wheat crops or whatever that are perennial, that leads to less soil disturbance because they're out there all the time, deeper root systems which move carbon deep into the profile. They have bigger, deeper root systems. As those roots eventually die and decay, it leaves a lot of carbon in the soil. So a very positive thing for it. And there's a lot of work. The Land Institute in this country has been kind of at the forefront of doing research in that area. Here on campus, I know Matt Ryan and probably others are doing some research on perennial grains. So I think it's a real thing. It's something that's kind of at the cutting edge of research along the lines of biochar and some other things that could be part of the solution.
Yeah, I guess one of my questions is, you have a dramatic increase in the need for food, an increase in the difficulty of producing food, and as far as I could see, a lack of ability to expand the acreage devoted to growing food. And all of that seems to me to come to kind of an unpleasant conclusion.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge. And we have to think about how can we more intensively use the land we've got without doing more harm to the environment. And how can what are the strategies for doing that? What are the strategies for putting back some of the carbon we've lost from our soils and restoring some land, or making sure that the land we are using isn't becoming degraded? We have to hope that, this is why I say I think we need all of the above in the arsenal of what we use to solve the problem, because it is a huge challenge. There's some parts of the world, for example, the very high latitudes, Canada, northern Russia. These are places where lands could be opened up for agriculture, which haven't been before. More of a possibility of growing crops there and that sort of thing. So some lands could open up there. So some good news possibly for some of those areas. Bad news for a lot of the tropics where heating is nothing but bad news, and they've already got degraded soils. So we also have to have food distribution systems and support systems that avoid that kind of problem.
And I also have a second question, which is about recycling wastes in the food system. So there's all of the plant wastes. There's the wastes from animal agriculture. If you go to a vegan diet, you no longer have the waste from animal agriculture. And it seems to me the missing piece here is the human wastes, which are problematic to recycle. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, there's some work done on that. I don't know a whole lot about that, but I know in places in Africa, there's some work being done on using that for kitchen garden level fertilization and that kind of thing. As I say, in some places, farmers have a real difficult time leaving, like here, it's pretty easy for a farmer to leave the stalks of a corn plant in place and then put those back into the soil, basically feeding the soil some of that organic matter. But in many other parts of the world, they harvest that too to heat the home. But using kitchen waste and human waste that's been treated in a way that it's not going to cause a food safety issue is part of the solution there. So it definitely is part of the solution. Yeah. And then there's one in the front here when you get a chance down there. Someone's been.
Yeah, I just was curious. You didn't really talk about aquaculture at all.
Oh, yeah.
Just wondering, what your thoughts are on the role of aquaculture.
Yeah, so it's not an area I have a lot of expertise on, so that's one reason I didn't get into it. But there too, I think it's. I think we have to. I think it's got to be part of what we're doing and trying to expand. First of all, a lot of the fish we eat, it's like the old days of going out and collecting wild animals from the wild and just depleting those and eating, bringing them to near extinction. So we have to think about aquaculture to feed more people. However, it depends a lot on how it's done, and there's a lot of environmental damage from a lot of aquaculture right now. But there's a lot of people working on that, and a lot of success stories too that I've heard, but I don't know a lot about it. But it should be part of the story, yeah, for sure. Yeah, there was someone in the front who had his hand up a lot.
Do you think it's possible to build a bio-based farm? The cow produce the manure, can be fertilize the crop, and the carbon dioxide also can be used by the crop, and the crop produce the food for the cows, and it's kind of a closed circle, so no waste, no emission. Do you think it's possible? Is there any calculation?
Well, I mean, there's a whole field of agroecology really, which kind of has that as the kind of the in many ways the ambition. Natural ecosystems tend to be kind of a closed system where the leaves fall and they're degraded and the nutrients are recycled that way. And so trying to build our farming systems that are more that way is an ambition. And I do think there's we can make some significant progress that way. There's a lot of logistical challenges, whereas particularly when you have big distance between farm production, animal production systems and crop production systems, for example, it can be a big challenge. But there's a lot of people working on this. The idea of the manure, being used to put carbon into the soil and is a good thing. The CO2 released when some of that eventually gets degraded is not likely to really benefit the plants in any direct way. But there is this thing of like getting energy from waste, either through pyrolysis, which is a way to create biochar, or anaerobic digesters, which captures methane gas from waste burning, and then uses that as an energy source. So I think there's some ways of closing the system somewhat. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions for Professor Wolfe?
Just have one question about the hierarchy of crops that have the best yield per input of fertilizer / inputs. Is there sort of a hierarchy of will get more benefit from this crop than that crop?
Well, we have, like the peas and beans and all of those crops are legume crops. So they have much less reduced nitrogen inputs because they have a symbiotic relationship with these bacteria in their roots that basically gather N2 gas from the soil air spaces and produce nitrogen that goes right into the roots of the plant in a form that the plants can use it. So legume crops in rotation and legume crops often in themselves reduce that nitrogen, that carbon footprint associated with nitrogen fertilizer manufacture or nitrogen fertilizer application. So those tend to be kind of near the top of sort of low carbon footprint crops. And then simply rotating with those kind of crops with other cash crops is, another good idea. And then was mentioned perennial crops, those often can, they take longer to establish, but they can be near the top of the sort of the low carbon footprint over time, which is why there's this interest in perennial grains, et cetera.
One final question?
Sure.
So you kind of alluded to the political tensions between farmers and like sustainability advocates. I don't know if you are familiar with the controversy over including sustainability in the dietary guidelines, but sort of thinking about that, do you have any thoughts on how we can bridge that divide?
Yeah, well, I think, farmers do like to view themselves as stewards of the land, and they are there 24/7 and all entire lifetimes, and they have a natural tendency to be concerned about environmental issues, but they also have like kids they want to send to college and things like that, and they have just they worry about their income level, so they're open to experimenting with new ideas, but it's got to be relatively cost effective. We can't expect them to take the burden of producing our food and bear all the cost of doing it in some way that protects the environment but maybe gives them very low yields, unless somehow we can guarantee them higher prices for the food that they produce. And so there's got to be give and take there in terms of the policies that we develop. But there's a lot of good people working on coming up with creative policy solutions. Like I mentioned, that soil health partnership, which has corn growers, conventional corn growers, Walmart, not exactly, just biggest food retailer in the world, but also the Nature Conservancy, which is dedicated to really protecting the environment, looking for policy solutions. So there's people working on it and looking at sort of win-win solutions. And I think, as I say, farmers are open to doing what they can, but they are also worried about radical and uncertainty about policy as much as they are uncertainty about the climate, for example. So even a policy which might be a little tough for them to adapt to, if there's some certainty about it and it's sort of stepped in a step at a time, they've got time to prepare for it, they're giving maybe some subsidies or something to adapt to it, whatever, there's ways of moving farmers towards new systems. And there's a lot of new thinking. I mean, the soil health program here at Cornell, for example, it's not just, of course, organic farmers have been talking to us about this for years before we were doing much about it. But we have most of our most conventional farmers in New York are very interested in soil health because they've seen on their farm, the organic matter in the farm that their parents had was higher than what they inherited. And they don't want to pass that on to their kids, an even worse legacy. So they came to us and said, how do we rebuild this organic matter and yet still, make our farm profits? So we've worked with them on that. So yeah, it's difficult, it's challenging. Okay, thanks. Thanks for hanging in there, as we did.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.